The ballroom fell silent the moment Lydia Ashford turned and walked away from her husband. No raised voice, no tears, no accusation, just silence. The chandeliers of Der Ashford house burned above the crowd like frozen stars while whispers rippled through the noble guests. The Duchess had just left the Duke standing alone in the middle of the floor. And she had done it without a single word. Nathaniel, Duke of Ashford Town, did not move. A man feared in Parliament, a man whose presence could silence entire drawing rooms, now stood utterly still as the doors of the ballroom closed behind his wife. Someone laughed nervously. Someone else murmured something about marital disagreements. Nathaniel heard none of it. All he could hear was the echo of her footsteps fading down the corridor, and the terrible realization that something had just ended. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of silence, 3 years of distance he had believed safe, until the moment she chose to leave him in front of half of London society. He forced himself to move. "Your Grace?" the steward asked quietly. Nathaniel ignored him. He walked out of the ballroom and into the long marble corridor where Lydia had disappeared. The house was quiet here. The distant music of the orchestra floated faintly through the walls, but the corridor itself felt hollow, almost abandoned. Nathaniel slowed as he reached the staircase. She was gone. Of course she was. Lydia had always moved like that, softly, gracefully, as if she were careful not to disturb the air around her. Careful not to disturb him. For 3 years he had allowed that quiet obedience, and now she had vanished. Nathaniel stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty staircase. Then he turned away, because he knew exactly where she had gone. 2 hours later, the townhouse was dark. The guests had left. The servants moved quietly through the halls, extinguishing candles and clearing the remains of the evening. Nathaniel walked the corridor outside Lydia's chambers. His footsteps slowed. There it was again, that hesitation, the same hesitation that had haunted him every night for 3 years. He stopped before her door. 1 second, 2, 3. His hand almost lifted to knock, but it fell again, because he already knew what waited on the other side of that door. Silence. A polite wife. A woman who never asked questions. A woman he had married for duty and treated like a ghost. Nathaniel exhaled slowly and turned away, just as he had every other night. Lydia stood at the window when she heard his footsteps outside her door. She knew the rhythm instantly, the slow cadence, the faint drag of his right shoe against the Persian carpet. She did not turn. She did not breathe. 3 seconds. Always 3 seconds. Then the sound of his steps fading toward his own rooms. Gone. Again. Lydia closed her eyes. 3 years. 3 years since she had become Duchess of Ashford. 3 years since she had promised before God and London society to love a man who had never once looked at her as if she truly existed. She tightened the silk shawl around her shoulders and stared out over the moonlit gardens of Mayfair. The roses below swayed gently in the wind. Beautiful, perfect, and carefully pruned into shapes they had never chosen themselves. "Enough," she whispered. Her voice sounded strange in the quiet room, almost unfamiliar. Lydia turned from the window and walked slowly toward the rosewood writing desk. The candle flickered to life beneath the match. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded a sheet of paper. She had delayed this moment for weeks. But tonight something had broken, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, the way hearts often do. She dipped the pen into ink. "My dear Nathaniel." She stopped. The words looked foolish, too intimate for a man who barely spoke her name. She crossed them out. Started again. "Your Grace. I request permission to spend the summer at Ashford Manor in Kent. I believe the country air will be beneficial to my health." The words were neat. Polite? Perfectly acceptable. Exactly what a duchess should write. What she did not write was the truth. That she could no longer endure being invisible in her own marriage. That she could no longer sit across from an empty chair at breakfast pretending not to notice the absence beside her. That the silence had finally become unbearable. She signed simply, Lydia. Not Duchess, not wife, just Lydia, the name he never used. She sealed the letter with red wax and placed it carefully on the silver tray outside her chamber door. By morning it would reach him, and he would approve. He always approved anything that kept her distant. Lydia extinguished the candle and lay down in the enormous bed that had never once been shared. The velvet canopy loomed above her like a dark sky. She stared upward for a long time, listening to the quiet, wondering if there would ever come a moment when she did not feel like a guest in her own life. When the sun rose the next morning, she had not slept at all, and somewhere down the corridor, Nathaniel Ashford was just beginning to understand that his wife's silence might cost him far more than he had ever imagined. Nathaniel read Lydia's letter 3 times before he fully understood it. The morning light filtering through the heavy velvet curtains of his study fell across the page in pale gold, illuminating every careful word. It was a perfectly respectable request, A duchess spending the summer at the country estate was neither unusual nor improper. Many ladies did the same. And yet something about the letter unsettled him. Nathaniel leaned back slowly in his chair. "I request permission." The phrase echoed in his mind. Lydia had never asked for anything before. Not once in 3 years. She had accepted everything. His absence, his indifference, the empty seat beside her at dinners and balls. With a quiet composure that had always disturbed him more than anger ever could. Her grace made him feel like a villain. He ran a hand across his face. He had slept poorly again. He always did. The nights were the worst. The club, the whiskey, friends asking careless questions about the Duchess. Then the carriage ride home through dark London streets. And finally the corridor, her door. Those cursed 3 seconds. Nathaniel stared down at the letter again. Something about it felt final. Not dramatic, not bitter, simply calm, as if she had already made her peace with something he had not yet begun to understand. His chest tightened unexpectedly. Nathaniel pushed the thought away. He dipped the pen in ink and wrote quickly, "As you wish. Arrangements will be made." He signed it without rereading the words. If he reread them, he might hesitate, and hesitation was dangerous. Lydia deserved peace, even if it meant peace away from him, especially if it meant that. The week that followed passed quietly, almost eerily so. Lydia prepared for her departure with the same composed efficiency that defined everything she did. She selected her traveling gowns, spoke softly with the housemaids, wrote polite notes to the few acquaintances she maintained in London society. No one questioned the decision. A duchess retreating to the country for the summer was entirely proper, respectable, convenient. On the morning of her departure, the household awoke early. The carriage stood ready in the courtyard. Footmen loaded trunks while the horses stamped impatiently against the cobblestones. Lydia descended the grand staircase in a navy traveling dress, her hair arranged in a simple chignon beneath a modest hat. She paused halfway down the steps. The house was strangely quiet. Servants lined the walls respectfully. But there was one absence she could not help noticing. Nathaniel was not there. Of course he wasn't. She had not expected him to be. And yet, her eyes moved instinctively toward the study door, the library, the entrance hall, as though at the final moment he might appear. Say something, anything. But the house remained silent. Lydia inhaled slowly and forced a gentle smile. "Thank you," she said softly to the butler who opened the door. Outside, the morning air was cool and bright. She stepped into the carriage without looking back. When the wheels began to turn, she folded her hands in her lap and fixed her gaze firmly on the road ahead. Behind her, Ashford House grew smaller and smaller until it vanished entirely from view. Nathaniel watched the carriage leave from the window of his study. He had seen it arrive in the courtyard, had heard the servants moving through the halls, had known precisely what hour Lydia would depart, and still he had not gone downstairs. Now the carriage disappeared through the gates, the iron bars closed behind it, and suddenly the house felt empty. Nathaniel turned away sharply. Ridiculous. She had been present in this house for 3 years, and it had never once felt full. Why should her absence matter now? He poured himself a glass of brandy, though it was barely 10 in the morning. The liquid burned his throat. He welcomed the feeling, anything to silence the quiet unease creeping into his chest. But the silence remained, because somewhere deep in his mind a memory had begun to stir. A pair of dark laughing eyes. A small room above a merchant's shop. The sound of a girl reciting Byron badly while teasing him for taking poetry too seriously. Isabel. He closed his eyes. 3 years had passed since her death. 3 years since fever had stolen her from him in the span of a single brutal week. And only 1 month later he had stood before the altar at Tacum St. George's Church, marrying Lydia Ashford. Duty, title, heir, everything Isabel could never have given him. Everything Lydia had given without ever asking for anything in return. Nathaniel opened his eyes slowly. Outside, the gardens of Mayfair glowed under the early summer sun. Lydia used to walk there every morning. He had seen her sometimes from the window. A pale dress moving among the roses, a French book always in her hand. He had never joined her, never even spoken to her during those quiet walks. He picked up her letter again. The ink had already dried. "I request permission." The words looked different now, less like a request, more like a farewell. Nathaniel stared at the empty gardens for a long moment. Then he reached for the brandy again, because the strange tightening in his chest had begun to feel dangerously close to regret. And regret was a feeling the Duke of Ashford had spent 3 years carefully avoiding. Ashford Manor appeared at dusk. After 6 hours on the road, Lydia leaned forward slightly in the carriage as the countryside of Kent unfolded before her. Rolling green hills, quiet cottages, and fields brushed gold by the lowering sun. It felt impossibly far from London, far from the glittering ballrooms, far from the silence that had followed her through Ashford House like a shadow. When the carriage finally slowed before the iron gates of the estate, Lydia released a breath she had not realized she had been holding. The manor stood beyond the trees, a broad 17th-century stone house surrounded by wild gardens and a small lake where swans drifted across the water. It looked less like a ducal residence and more like a place that had quietly waited to be lived in. The carriage stopped. The door opened. "Your Grace." Mrs. Thornton, the housekeeper, stood waiting at the steps with a warm, genuine smile that Lydia had not encountered in London for a very long time. "Lady Ashford," the older woman said, curtsying. "It is a pleasure to have you here. The house has been terribly quiet." Lydia stepped down from the carriage. The evening air smelled faintly of damp earth and roses. "Thank you, Mrs. Thornton," she said gently. "I believe I shall enjoy the quiet." And for the first time in 3 years she realized she meant it. The days that followed felt almost unreal. Lydia woke early each morning, long before the servants stirred, and walked through the gardens while the mist still clung to the roses. Here no one watched her. No one whispered behind gloved hands. No one measured the distance between husband and wife. Here she was simply Lydia. She spent hours wandering through the wild gardens that had not been pruned in seasons. The roses grew freely, twisting over stone walls and climbing along wooden trellises in soft chaos. Their imperfection made them beautiful. In the afternoon, she explored the small manor library, discovering shelves filled with forgotten novels and travel journals. Some were in French. She read them slowly beside the open windows while sunlight warmed the room. In the evening, she played the piano in the music room. The notes sometimes faltered. Sometimes she made mistakes, but there was no one present to judge them. For the first time since her wedding, Lydia felt something she had almost forgotten existed. Freedom. Mrs. Thornton watched the transformation quietly. One afternoon, they took tea together in the garden. A small impropriety Lydia would never have dared in London. "It is good to see laughter in this house again," Mrs. Thornton said as she poured the tea. "Has it been so empty?" Lydia asked gently. "His Grace has not visited in many years." Lydia paused. "Not even before our marriage?" The housekeeper hesitated. "Only once, my lady, when the old Duke passed away." Lydia lowered her cup slowly. "That was 5 years ago." "Yes, Your Grace." A silence settled between them. Then Mrs. Thornton spoke again, carefully. "There was someone here before your time." Lydia's fingers tightened slightly around the porcelain cup. "A young woman from the village?" The housekeeper chose her words with care. "Her father owned the mill. She died suddenly. Fever." Lydia stared out across the garden. She had always known, not through gossip, not through servants, but through the quiet grief that had lived in Nathaniel's eyes on their wedding day. "Isabel," Lydia said softly. Mrs. Thornton's eyes widened. "You knew?" He spoke her name once in his sleep. The confession felt strangely calm. The truth had never been the most painful part. Understanding it had always been worse. Lydia set the teacup down carefully. "I am glad someone loved him," she said after a moment. Mrs. Thornton studied her with a mixture of admiration and sadness. "You are very kind, my lady." "No," Lydia said quietly. "I am merely realistic, because loving a man who had loved someone else first was not tragedy. The tragedy was loving him alone." That evening, Lydia sat by the window of the library reading a French novel. The sun had nearly set. The sky beyond the lake glowed violet and gold. But as she turned the page, a strange dizziness washed over her. She frowned. Perhaps she had spent too many hours in the sun. Her head felt warm. Her vision blurred slightly. Lydia rose slowly from the chair. The room tilted. She reached for the edge of the table but missed. The book slipped from her fingers. By the time Mrs. Thornton found her an hour later, the Duchess of Ashford lay unconscious on the library floor, and far away in London, the man who had spent 3 years refusing to see his wife had no idea that the fragile distance between them was about to collapse. The letter arrived in London on a grey, rain-soaked morning. Nathaniel was seated in his study at Ashford House, staring without interest at a stack of estate documents when the butler entered quietly. "Your Grace, a letter from Kent." Nathaniel accepted it absently, but the moment he saw the careful, formal handwriting, something inside him tightened. "Mrs. Thornton." He broke the seal. "Your Grace. Lady Ashford has taken ill. The physician has been summoned. The fever appears severe, though we hope it is only exhaustion. I thought it my duty to inform you immediately." Nathaniel did not remember standing. He did not remember the chair crashing to the floor behind him. All he knew was the sudden roar in his ears. Fever. The word burned through his mind. Another fever. The memory struck him with brutal force. Isabel in a narrow bed above the miller's shop, her skin burning beneath his hand. The physician shaking his head. The helpless certainty that nothing could be done. Nathaniel crushed the letter in his fist. "No," he muttered. The word came out like a vow. "Not again." The rain began as the carriage left London. By the time they reached the countryside, it had become a storm. The wheels slid dangerously through the mud-soaked roads while thunder rolled across the dark sky. Nathaniel leaned forward inside the carriage, gripping the leather seat as though he could force the horses to move faster. The fear inside him had become something alive, a terrible, suffocating certainty that he would arrive too late, just as he had 3 years before. His mind filled with images he could not escape. Lydia standing alone at the altar. Lydia sitting quietly across the breakfast table. Lydia walking through the Mayfair gardens with a book in her hand. Always silent, always distant, and always there. Until she had left. Until he had let her leave. Nathaniel pressed a hand against his eyes. God, he had wasted 3 years. 3 years punishing a woman for a grief she had never caused. 3 years refusing to see the quiet dignity of the wife standing before him every day. And now he might lose her. Please, he whispered hoarsely into the storm. He did not know who he was praying to. Perhaps no one. But the plea came anyway. Not before I can tell her. Tell her what? That he had been a coward. That he had buried himself in grief instead of facing the life still standing beside him. That Lydia Ashford deserved far more than a husband who treated her like a shadow. The carriage nearly overturned on a sharp bend. Nathaniel grabbed the side of the seat. He barely noticed. All he could see was Lydia's face. Not the calm, polite expression she showed society, but the one he had glimpsed only rarely. The sadness in her eyes when she believed no one was watching. The quiet resignation of a woman who had learned not to hope. His doing, all of it. By the time the carriage reached Ashford Manor, the rain was falling in sheets. Nathaniel jumped down before the wheels had fully stopped. He ran up the stone steps 2 at a time. The front door burst open before he could knock. Mrs. Thornton stood there, her expression startled. Your Grace, we did not expect. Where is she? In the main chamber, my lord, but... Nathaniel was already halfway up the staircase. The door to Lydia's room stood slightly open. Nathaniel pushed it wider. The room was quiet. Too quiet. For a moment his chest tightened with the same terrible dread he had felt years ago. Then he saw her. Lydia sat upright in the bed, pale but awake, a cup of tea resting between her hands. Her hair had been loosely braided. A shawl rested around her shoulders. She looked fragile, but alive. Nathaniel stopped in the doorway. Rainwater dripped from his coat onto the polished floor. Lydia looked up slowly. Her eyes widened. Nathaniel? It was the first time she had spoken his name in 3 years. The sound of it nearly undid him. He stepped forward slowly. Are you well? He asked hoarsely. Lydia blinked as though unsure the moment was real. The fever has passed, she said quietly. The physician says it was exhaustion. Nathaniel repeated the words like a man testing reality. Exhaustion. Yes. A strange silence filled the room. 3 years of distance stood between them like an invisible wall. You did not need to come, Lydia said gently. Nathaniel shook his head. I needed to. The truth hung in the air between them. And for the first time since their wedding day, Nathaniel Ashford looked directly into his wife's eyes. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows of the manor bedroom, filling the silence with a restless rhythm. Nathaniel remained near the door as if uncertain whether he had the right to step any closer. Lydia sat upright against the pillows, pale but composed. Her hands folded loosely in her lap. 3 years of unspoken distance lingered between them like a wall neither of them quite knew how to cross. Finally, Lydia broke the silence. Why? Her voice was quiet, almost careful. Nathaniel frowned slightly. Why what? Why did you come? The question held no accusation. That somehow made it worse. Nathaniel looked down at his hands, still damp from the rain. I received Mrs. Thornton's letter, he said slowly. She wrote that you were ill. Lydia nodded faintly. Yes. And you came, she finished softly. Nathaniel exhaled. Yes. Another silence settled between them. Then Lydia spoke again. You did not come to see me off when I left London. The words were simple, a statement, but Nathaniel felt them land like a blade. You're right, he admitted quietly. Lydia watched him carefully. The man standing before her looked different from the one she had known in London. His hair was damp from the storm. His coat clung to his shoulders. The proud composure of the Duke of Ashford seemed strangely absent. In its place there was something raw, almost uncertain. Do you know, Lydia said slowly, that in 3 years you never once came to my door? Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly. I know. Not once, she repeated. I heard you sometimes. Her gaze drifted toward the door of the chamber. You always stopped outside. Nathaniel's throat tightened. 3 seconds. Always 3 seconds. I thought you did not wish to see me, he said hoarsely. Lydia looked genuinely startled. Not wish to see you? You never asked for my company. Because I was your wife, she said quietly. I thought it was not something one should have to request. The truth of it struck him with brutal clarity. Nathaniel stepped farther into the room. The distance between them shortened slightly. "I was a coward," he said. The words sounded harsh even to his own ears. Lydia did not immediately respond. "You love someone else," she said after a moment. It was not a question. Nathaniel went still. "Yes." The single word carried the weight of years. "Isabel," Lydia said softly. Nathaniel's breath caught. "How did you—" "You spoke her name once," Lydia said. "While you slept." Nathaniel stared at her. There was no anger in her voice, only quiet understanding. "She died before our wedding," he said slowly. "Fever." Lydia nodded faintly. "I suspected." Nathaniel dragged a hand through his damp hair. "I married you because it was my duty," he continued. "My father was gone. The title required an heir. And I was suitable." The words came from Lydia without bitterness. "Yes." Nathaniel swallowed. "And I punished you for it." Lydia finally looked directly at him. "You punished yourself," she said softly. "No," Nathaniel replied. "I punished you." He took another step closer to the bed. "Every day I saw your patience, your kindness, your dignity." His voice roughened, and it made me feel like a monster. Lydia's fingers tightened slightly in the blankets. "I never asked you to love me," she said. "I only hoped you might one day see me." Nathaniel felt the words like a blow. "I see you now," he said. Lydia's eyes searched his face. "Do you?" "Yes." The room fell quiet again. Then Lydia shook her head faintly. "You see me because I nearly died." Nathaniel flinched. "That is not true." "Isn't it?" Her voice remained gentle, but something stronger lay beneath it now. "If the letter had never arrived, would you have come here?" Nathaniel had no answer. The silence stretched too long. Lydia looked away. "That is what I feared," she said quietly. Nathaniel moved then, crossing the final distance between them. He knelt beside the bed, a duke kneeling before his wife. Something almost unheard of. "I cannot change the past," he said. "But I can change what happens next." Lydia studied him carefully. "And if the past returns?" she asked softly. "If grief takes hold of you again?" Nathaniel did not look away this time. "Then I will face it." He hesitated before reaching for her hand. "For the first time," he said quietly. "And not alone." Lydia allowed him to hold her hand, but uncertainty still flickered in her eyes, because hope, after 3 years of silence, was a very dangerous thing. Nathaniel remained beside the bed long after their conversation ended. Neither of them seemed certain how to leave the moment. Lydia's hand still rested in his. The contact felt unfamiliar, strangely fragile. 3 years of distance could not be undone in a single afternoon. Finally, Lydia spoke again. "You should change out of those wet clothes." Nathaniel glanced down at his rain-soaked coat as if only now remembering the storm. "Yes, perhaps I should." But he did not move. Lydia noticed. "Are you afraid to leave the room?" she asked gently. Nathaniel gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "Yes." The honesty surprised them both. "I spent 3 years avoiding this door," he admitted. "Now I am afraid that if I walk away again, the distance will return." Lydia studied him carefully. The Duke of Ashford, proud, feared, untouchable, now looked almost uncertain. It stirred something complicated inside her chest. "You may leave the room, Nathaniel," she said softly, "but you must promise to come back." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 3 years. Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I will." Over the following days, the atmosphere at Ashford Manor changed in quiet, cautious ways. Nathaniel did not return to London. Instead, he remained at the estate. At first, Lydia suspected it was merely guilt, but each morning he appeared at breakfast. Each afternoon he walked with her through the gardens, and each evening they sat together in the library, speaking in careful, halting conversations that slowly grew easier. It was strange, almost like meeting a new person. Nathaniel discovered that Lydia read French literature fluently, that she played the piano not because society demanded it, but because music steadied her thoughts, that she possessed sharp political opinions she had never dared voice in London drawing rooms. Lydia, in turn, discovered that Nathaniel disliked the London season as much as she did, that he sometimes wrote poetry in secret. Terrible poetry. "Show me," Lydia said one afternoon when he admitted it. "Absolutely not." "Why?" "Because it is dreadful." She lifted an eyebrow. "That sounds entertaining." Against his better judgment, he eventually read one. It was, in fact, dreadful. Lydia laughed so hard she had to wipe tears from her eyes. Nathaniel stared at her in stunned disbelief. "Are you mocking me, Your Grace?" "Yes," she said cheerfully. "And it is delightful." To his surprise, he found himself laughing as well. The sound felt unfamiliar, but not unpleasant. One evening, nearly 3 weeks after his arrival, Nathaniel woke from a nightmare, the same one that had haunted him for years. Isabel's fever, the physician's silence. the coffin descending into the earth. He sat in the dark library staring at an untouched glass of brandy. Footsteps approached softly. Lydia entered wearing a pale robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. I wondered where you had gone. Nathaniel rubbed a hand over his face. I did not wish to wake you. You didn't. She sat quietly beside him. For a while neither of them spoke. Then Nathaniel said quietly, I still dream of her. Lydia nodded. That seems natural. I fear it will hurt you. It does, she admitted gently. But not in the way you think. Nathaniel looked at her. I do not wish to replace her memory, Lydia continued. I only wish to stand beside it. The words stunned him. You deserve far more than that. Perhaps, she said softly. But life rarely gives us perfect choices. Nathaniel looked at their hands resting side by side on the table. Carefully he reached for hers. She did not pull away. They sat like that for a long time as the first light of dawn crept through the tall windows. Two people bound by grief, and perhaps slowly by something else. Something fragile. Something neither of them had yet dared to name. Autumn arrived quietly at Ashford Manor. The gardens that Lydia had tended through the summer now glowed with deep crimson roses and drifting golden leaves. The lake shimmered beneath pale afternoon light, and the great house, once silent and empty, felt alive again. Nathaniel stood in the library window watching Lydia walk along the garden path with a basket on her arm. She moved slowly among the rose bushes, trimming the last blooms of the season. The wind tugged gently at the ribbon in her hair. For a long moment he simply watched her. 6 months ago she had walked away from him in a London ballroom. 6 months ago he had nearly lost her forever, and yet here she was, alive, laughing, real. He would never again pretend not to see her. Behind him the library door opened. Lydia stepped inside carrying the roses. You are staring again, she said with a faint smile. Nathaniel crossed the room without hesitation. Yes, he replied. I have developed a habit of it. He gently wiped a smudge of soil from her cheek with his thumb. You have dirt on your face. I know. You look beautiful. The words made Lydia pause. Even now she was still learning how to accept them. He took the roses from her and set them on the table before drawing her closer. You missed tea, she said lightly. I was distracted. By what? Nathaniel studied her face, the quiet strength, the warmth she had brought back into this house. Into his life. By my wife, he said. Lydia laughed softly. You are becoming scandalously sentimental, Your Grace. I am merely honest. He took her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. Do you regret it? Lydia tilted her head. Regret what? Leaving London, staying here with me. She looked around the room, the open windows, the roses on the table, the fire waiting to be lit for evening. Then she looked back at him. I regret only one thing. Nathaniel's expression tightened. What is that? That we wasted 3 years believing we had no choice. The truth of it struck him deeply. He reached up and cupped her face gently. I cannot return those years to you. You have already given me something better, Lydia said softly. And what is that? Now. Nathaniel pulled her into his arms. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the roses in the garden. Inside the library, the silence felt warm instead of empty. For the first time since their wedding, Nathaniel Ashford understood what it meant to share a life with another person. Not duty, not obligation, choice. Lydia, he said quietly. Yes? I never told you something. What is that? His voice softened. Thank you for not giving up on me. She rested her head against his chest. I did give up, she said honestly. Nathaniel froze. But then, she continued gently, you followed me. A slow smile crossed his face. I would follow you anywhere. Even back to London? Nathaniel made a face. Let us not be unreasonable. Lydia laughed. The sound echoed through the library like sunlight. Outside, Mrs. Thornton watched from the garden path with quiet satisfaction. The house had once been hollow. Now it breathed again. The Duke had lost one great love in his life. But it was the woman who remained. The woman who had walked away in silence, who finally taught him how to live. And this time, Nathaniel Ashford never hesitated outside her door again.